world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to STRATEGIKON, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. In this episode of STRATEGIKON, we'll be joined from the UK by Commodore Patrick J. Tyrrell, OBE, Royal Navy retired, Chair of the SAGE International Australia Management Board and SIA's Senior Non-Resident Fellow Global and Maritime Security. Also from the UK, Pete Warren, Editor of Future Intelligence and Chair of the Cyber Security Research Institute, and Professor Andrew Jones of the University of Suffolk, and also author of Global Information Warfare. Today's topic, China attacks. The PRC's June 2020 cyber attack on Australia and what this means for Sino-Australian relations. Joining us via Zoom in our virtual studio today is co-host David Olney. Hello, David.
Good evening, good morning, and good something to everyone.
And our producer, Tim Whiffen. Hello, Tim.
It's very nice to have to be here.
Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that STRATEGIKON can be found on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and on the SAGE International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Okay, well, last week, Prime Minister Morrison announced that Australia had been hit by a comprehensive cyber attack affecting the national, public and private sectors. He was reluctant to name the attacker, though all fingers quickly pointed to China, considering the frosty state of bilateral Sino-Australian relations to date. But Australia isn't the only country that has China isn't the only country that has sophisticated hacking capabilities. There's Russia, Iran, and North Korea as well. If it was China, why the reluctance to declare it the aggressor? Rory Medcalf from the ANU's National Security College says calling out the cyber attacks without naming the offender was a useful tactic. And I quote, "I think it is carefully measured. It is not as provocative as some people will claim it to be," end quote. But was it carefully measured or simply a demonstration of governmental impotence? If I could pass this one directly to Pete Warren.
I think there's a big issue here about deniability and calling out who aggressors are. And I think, quite evidently, this is the biggest issue that we have with the internet today. Because, everybody on balance says, yes, we think this is the People's Republic of China. But no one wants to say it because it could equally be the Americans wanting to try to put the Chinese into hot water, because in the current situation, Mike Pompeo would be pretty keen in ratcheting up the pressure against China, because Donald Trump is pretty keen to ratchet up the pressure against China. So my take on this is that we should start getting grown up about all of this. I can remember, about 15 years ago or so, Professor Jones invited me to Martlesham Heath, BT's research centre in Suffolk. And oddly, two Chinese academics were demonstrating a system where you could actually strip deniability out of the internet. And I think the cost at that time that they were talking about was, I think it was around £1.5 or £2 billion, which is nothing. If you consider the cost of the pandemic alone, which we've managed to come to grips with, the cost, the price, or the ongoing price of having this deniability built into a network is huge. We have to do something about it to stop these sorts of attacks, these attempts at political pressure. Something has to be done. It might sound like a large amount of money. It's not a large amount of money in terms of cybercrime.
Professor Jones, what do you think?
I can't disagree with anything that Peter's just said. The reality is, we may strongly suspect, with good reason perhaps, that it is China, but provability is something totally different. And if you're going to ratchet up the war of words, if you like, best you have some evidence to back it up. there are lots of other players out there that it may be, or it may be a combination. People jumping on the bandwagon. But yes, we may all strongly suspect that it is probably motivated and driven by China.
Okay, Pat, what do you think?
Well, I'd like to sort of take a step back from the Australian example of last week. I mean, the thing you've got to understand about cyber attacks and information warfare, it's easy. It's done with small pieces of equipment and clever people sitting in back rooms wherever they like. If you just look at the way that you gentlemen all cover the face of the globe at the moment, yet we're engaging in a single conversation. So it's, from the point of view of warfare, it's relatively safe. You're unlikely to get attacked back by the enemies or by the military of the country you might be attacking. It's, as we have seen, the deniability is easy, and you only have to look back at a succession of attacks that there have been where countries, be it Russia or China or Romania, have been able to say, it wasn't us. And because it's cheap, it's easy, and it can be very effective, the groups that are doing it are going to train themselves like any army is going to do. It's going to train its operatives to make sure they can do it more effectively. And we will have any number of these in the future. We can't protect the global internet perhaps in the way we want to. We're going to have to invest, as Peter suggested, quite, I would say, sizable chunks of money to make sure that we can determine where attacks are coming from and to be able to have a system that can ameliorate these attacks as they occur. So you can immediately break off one part of the network, reinforce it from a separate part of the network. You have to do the dynamic management of the network to protect the people. But it's the way we're going to be. We are going to be making use of modern technologies in the future, and it's in the interests of our enemies to be able to attack those. And of course, conversely, we need to defend against them, and we also need the ability to be able to attack people who wish us ill at some stage in the future.
David, do you have a question?
A couple of comments I'd like to make. First of all, I agree totally with everything everyone said. To my mind, this is a bit like the debate after 9/11, and that is, don't give these people oxygen. The more you talk about it, the more you increase levels of fear. Don't talk about it until we have the technology to show exactly where it came from. And the other side of this is look at the longer term strategy. Australian-Chinese relations have been terrible now for months. At the moment, the CCP is making the argument that Australia is a dangerous place for young Chinese people to be at uni. If an attack like this can wind up the Australian people, ups the level of racism, China proves its point, and continues to destroy our education industry. So they get a double win. They potentially destabilise our technical networks and destabilise our education system, which is one of the most valuable things we have. So a prime minister that says, well, we've had this attack, but I'm not saying who's going to do it under current circumstances, is just immaterial of who did it, giving the CCP a freebie.
Tim?
My understanding was that the attack was so bad that it necessitated a comment, effectively, from our Prime Minister. The problem being is that it's, as David said, kind of reinforcing anti-Chinese sentiment in this country, and we just don't have the kind of strategic literacy to be talking about it as if it's the CCP and not China. And so not being able to name this thing, but then so much speculation about who it is, and people are mainly saying China, even our national broadcasters, ABC, saying China, and then not having any other answers has absolutely been played into the CCP's hands, if that's if the intent was exactly what David just said. The civilian population of Australia is angry, and they don't know why. They don't know what's happened, why it's happened, and all they know is that something has happened, and it's all the information that they've got. It's been an interesting tension, I guess, between Scott Morrison needing to say something, but then not being able to say enough to calm any fears that have been, that have been caused. I have a question. If I
go on. Yep. Go.
China obviously has and we don't want to say that this is necessarily China. We don't have, let's say, the proof to back that up. But if this attack was by China, and that seems somewhat likely, that they have obviously a large population. You would imagine that they've got a burgeoning middle class that now has a lot of technological literacy. Their access to a population that has, let's say, hacking ability seems to be larger than ours, in the sense that if you've got a technologically literate population that is growing up in technologically authoritarian environment where they have no access to Facebook and things like that, and there's a whole meme culture of spreading Winnie the Pooh pictures about President Xi Jinping, that they would actually have probably this is a question, I guess. Do they have access to perhaps some of the best hackers in the world, or is that am I making an assumption that the civilian population of that just make their way into the kind of cyber military space?
Who would
Can
like
I answer that, John?
Yes, go for it.
I mean, I think that Tim, you're entirely right. They've got a very large group of extremely well-trained information engineers, cyber techs, because we've been training them. I mean, Australia's been training them, America's been training them, the United Kingdom's been training them. They have had a long history of sending their best people to the West for training, many of them being clearly operating partly on their own behalf to get a good education, but also partly working on a Chinese Communist Party remit to find out as much as they can. So we shouldn't be surprised that they've got that technology. I think that the big change has been that Xi Jinping has now gone to this warrior wolf philosophy, rather than the, I think was described as the panda diplomacy of previous years, and to go on the offensive. And so, for example, I was talking to a fellow alumni of mine who had been talking to the Vice Chancellor of Oxford University, and she had been contacted by a very senior member of the Chinese embassy in London, and the chap at the embassy said, "We don't like what you're doing, and in particular, we don't like the idea of Chris Patton coming out to Hong Kong. We want you to stop him, and if you don't, there will be trouble." So she said, "What do you mean, if I don't?" She said, "I have no control over where Chris Patton goes." And the diplomat said, we will ensure that there will be a large number of Chinese students who would otherwise come to Oxford University will not come. And she said, well, that's very interesting. She said, there are a lot of extremely able Indian students who wish to come to Oxford. And if the Chinese don't come, there will be plenty of vacancies for them, and put the phone down. And to some extent, you know, we need to fight fire with fire. We need to be forceful and in their face, rather than being quiet and almost in supplication to the Chinese. And I think that, you know, we're Anglo-Saxons who, apart from a bit of rape and pillage when you land on some poor defenseless island like England, you know, we're nice. You know, we're polite. We shouldn't be polite. We should be much more in your face with the Chinese, so that the Chinese are well aware that we won't back down over their threats and their actions.
I sort of agree with Pat, but there's 2 points. One, cyber is enormously attractive to any nation because the actual costs of participating are not high. So Bangladesh, for example, can become a cyber power pretty easily as long as it's got access to the internet. In terms of, Tim, to answer your question, there's a wonderful a scholar on the internet, and there's some very, very interesting sort of YouTube videos. His name is Mitra Sugara Mitra, and he's a professor of language at Newcastle University, but he did initially come from Delhi. He took a computer, stuck it in a hole in a wall in a Delhi slum, just as was. And all of the children taught themselves to not only learn English, they also taught themselves to program with no tuition whatsoever. And they taught each other, which, and very quickly, they taught each other much faster than if they'd have been actually at a school. And it's absolutely fascinating. It's one of the most incredible things I've ever seen. Now, if you can do that in Delhi, I'm sure you can do that anywhere else in the world. So this ability to be able to train up your soldiers, if I want for better expression, is, you know, really sort of out there. And then you have to also think about, okay, capability. I've worked with the Chinese when I started off in my career. One of the things that I noticed was that they were incredibly disciplined. They were very, very, very prepared to work very, very, very hard. Although it's been said that the creativity isn't great. Perhaps that's something that you could address by going to Oxford University, as Pat was saying. And perhaps they will be shooting themselves in the foot if they don't. So, you know, those are a couple of points about this, but also there's a final point too, which is I was interviewing or having an off-the-record conversation in the way that journalists do with someone very senior in the Cabinet Office, and they were saying that the problem that they have with having this sort of much more bullish attitude on the basis of not actually knowing that the attacker is the attacker is that, and obviously I'm being disparaging about my own kind, they were saying that journalists and newspaper editors always interpret that sort of activity as we're at war. And if you start saying you're at war, that then starts to ratchet up the ante. So, you know, and if you say to a general, and I'm now being disparaging about some of my other, the backgrounds of some of my other colleagues, if you start talking about bombs, then the generals start wanting to drop bombs on other people. So you have to have this very, very measured response, and getting that measurement right is very, very difficult. And that's why I'm saying, you know, you have to have this deniability built into the network, point one. Also, I think we're in a gestatory phase in all of this, because if you think about it, with so many people building up cyber competence, you're going to be hit by so many other people. You're not going to know who's hitting you soon. And so, in a sense, you've got to have somebody saying, actually, it was me, I hit you. But anyway, those are my thoughts.
Andy, you want to chime in with something?
Yeah, we're talking about this as if it's, you know, a single incident. The Chinese have been doing it for decades. Most of the current attacks seem to have been information gathering. That's been the Chinese philosophy for decades. When they had to put people in to do it, places like Los Alamos, they did. Now they don't have to. They can gather vast amount of information quite cheaply and easily over the internet. But this is not a new philosophy. This is not a new topic. You know, it's an ongoing. Yes, there's high tension now between Australia and China, and so it's not surprising that they probably ratcheted up what they were doing and have been doing for a long time, assuming it was them. But and taking, I think it was Peter's point earlier, you know, it may suit other people to ratchet up the tensions as well. But being ex-military, yeah, you know, I have this huge thing about journalists and politicians as well. You know, when you talk about cyber terrorism, to date, you know, cyber terrorism is a theory. Nobody, to my knowledge, has specifically died of a terrorist attack using cyber means. So, you know, the language is certainly journalists, you know, it's warfare, it's terrorism. No, it wasn't. It was a kid in a back room with a computer who was misguided or malicious, you know. Let's get the language right, and then perhaps understanding is better. Going back to the point of, you know, should he have said something? Did he have a choice? You know, he's got an obligation to warn people that they need to protect themselves. And I noticed from the reports I've seen that it's mostly the SMEs that are being targeted, and they are vulnerable. They always are. The same in the UK, you know, it is, when you look at the protection SMEs have got, it is woeful. But they are the supply chain through to large corporations and government. So the information they have, yes, is valuable, potentially.
Andy, just on that point, you know, you say that SMEs have a problem, but you know, there is also a problem at the big end of the corporate scale. I mean, Lockheed Martin's been raped and pillaged where it stood for all kinds of IP by parties unknown, shall we say, right? Now, you kind of think that if you are in charge of a multi-billion-dollar defense company, the one thing that you prize above everything else is your IP. So why are these companies so vulnerable? This is something that I still haven't quite gotten in my head. I mean, I've got a background in defense acquisition, and you know, so I've had to look at these companies and how they're structured. But what always kind of leaves me rather flummoxed is the fact that it seems that they're just not investing enough of their own energies in protecting the IP. So, you know, all of a sudden China develops the J-20 fighter. Ooh, does that look like an F-22/F-35 combo? I don't know, but it looks kind of like that, right? Or the C-17 theft, which then ended up being the Y-20. And the Y-20, and put that next to the C-17, looks kind of similar. This is huge in terms of what the Chinese apparently have been able to lift from the top end of the big end of the American military industrial complex, right?
Yeah, totally agree. Protecting IP is difficult. Let's be clear. It's not a trivial. But perhaps I think I would agree with you. There needs to be a bit of introspection and looking at why it's vulnerable, why it's not better protected, and it comes back to investment. SMEs you can sympathise with; they don't have the resources. But at the top end, when it's their business, you would have hoped that they would have done better. But again, if you have people embedded inside, it's almost impossible.
Pat, you had something?
Yes, I mean, just really to emphasize what Andy was saying, is that there are all sorts of reasons why people, be it the Chinese or the Russians or any industrial espionage group, can get inside any company, whether it's small or whether it's the size of Lockheed Martin. And that is to do with suborning people who are in the organization already. And indeed, one company I know that has some very interesting IPR doesn't have its IPR on any web or even on an internal web. It keeps it written in hard copy in a safe. That's the only secure way to make sure that nobody else is going to get in. Because, somebody gets an email that says, oh, click on this link and you can be an instant millionaire. Well, some idiot's going to do it. And so there is always a way of getting into these things. And we still have the good old-fashioned Olga and Svetlana going around and saying, I'm a gorgeous girl, I'll tell you what, just do this for me and we can go and live on a desert island for years to come. I have to say that after a career in the intelligence world, I've been looking forward to meeting Olga and Svetlana, probably both at the same time. Unfortunately, I have been singularly disappointed, but there we are. There are ways and means that ne'er-do-wells, be they governments or be they companies, can get inside your information systems. And they will keep trying, they'll keep probing, because new vulnerabilities will come up. Technology changes, so they'll try something new, and it'll then work. And they've got access to the whole, treasury of information in that particular company for a bit until they put a patch on it and things change. It's going to continue to happen. It's been happening since man first operated in small unit groups and decided that the grass was greener on the other side and was going to go and take over the tribe that was over the hill.
Last Thursday night, the Australian National Security Committee of Cabinet met to discuss the attacks. I mean, from what I've heard so far, it doesn't seem likely that it would be a good move for Australia to retaliate. But what I'd like to know is, should Australia retaliate? And if so, how?
I think in terms of retaliation, one of the things that goes back to where we were at the beginning. It's this question of knowing for certain that it was the person who attacked you. Because if you don't know that, then you start attacking somebody and they're sitting there thinking, oh, they're attacking me. And that's very unfair because we haven't done anything. So this issue about deniability needs to be sorted out, because obviously if you start retaliating, one of the things that people have said about cyber war is that it could be the precursor to a real war with real weapons, etc., etc. So, you know, that's the issue that you have if you don't lock down things in cyberspace. I'll actually also say, Pat, I understand, maybe it's right or maybe it's wrong, that you'd actually suggested back in 1996 that we should build up some borders in cyberspace so that we would identify particular assets that we should protect. Now, GCHQ, for example, is only tasked with looking after the interests of government. Perhaps we're at a stage now where that needs to be broadened. And I think in the paper that you wrote, you said that you needed to identify parts of the critical national infrastructure so that there would be lines in the sand that you would say that people shouldn't cross, and that we should define, you know, what the UK, what Australia is in cyberspace, and we should say you attack these things and we're really going to come after whoever did it. But again, you have the issue of deniability and who did it. So that's, you know, one big issue that you face in terms of retaliation. The other thing about this is, you know, and Andy Jones has been talking about cyber terrorism. One of the reasons why cyber terrorism isn't particularly attractive is if you look at the aftermath of the Stuxnet incident, then that affected not only the nuclear enrichment plant at Natanz, it also took out some power stations in other countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan. So, you know, the actual impact of what you do if you attack, you can't control that well. So, you know, that therefore becomes an issue too.
So really the best way of controlling the situation is to go back to basics. As Pat was saying, lock your secrets up in a safe, write your secrets down on a piece of paper, because someone will have to physically seize that piece of paper, as opposed to just, you know, having everything digitally imprinted everywhere for everyone to read and grab hold of the information, right? Is that
well, I mean, you know, to back up what Pat's been saying, I understand that some countries, India and Russia, had actually gone back to using typewriters and to communicate, and then scanning the documents and sending those. So again, you're answering what you think is the current climate. In terms of the SMEs that Andy's talking about, I think that there is going to be another gestation, which is that SMEs are going to say, look, we can't cope with this. We can't cope with these big players coming after us. There's a very interesting company, and I'm not pumping them, called Clario, who are actually taking over all of that responsibility. And they're saying, look, we'll manage everything. You don't have to worry about any of this. We'll look after what's going on. And a final point too is to go to something that Pat was saying about these large companies. You could get to a situation where you mandate, you say, right, you're a very large company. You are part of the critical national infrastructure just because of your role in our economy. So therefore, we are going to expect you to pay a mandatory amount of money to look after your cybersecurity. And, you know, I know this for a fact. Baroness Dido Harding, who was responsible for the now failed NHS app, I always thought that it was very telling that this was somebody who'd been put in charge of the NHS app who has a history of failed cybersecurity. She was responsible for the largest breach at TalkTalk. I know that at the time, she was cost-cutting as the head of TalkTalk, and she was actually cutting down on cybersecurity. The amount of money that TalkTalk was paying for threat intelligence was derisory. The amount they were paying a month was nothing in comparison to what a large company should pay. And she was also cutting headcount. She made the head of cyber redundant at the time she got attacked. So do you say, I know this is almost a question to Pat, do you say, going to your point, Pat, about the paper that you wrote, that we are going to mandate the very large organizations that they have to spend this amount of money because that's the price of being in the 21st century?
I think that I don't disagree with anything Peter said. The weak point in all our cyber preparations, cyber securities, is still the human being, in many different ways. And I'm not just talking about the chap who decides to load some malware onto a company computer. Peter, you were talking about some of the work that we were doing many, many years ago in the 1990s, and I'm reminded of an information operation that we wanted to launch against the citizens of Sarajevo in Serbia when they, under Milosevic, were running a sort of war in the Balkans. And one of the items that we had thought we would do is we wanted to get the supporters of Milosevic, who were the businesses in and around Belgrade. They were the rich entrepreneurs, if you like. And we wanted to persuade them that following Milosevic was not going to be good for their pocket. And the way we were going to do that was by launching an information campaign and at the same time dropping a special type of ordnance onto the electricity substations. And the ordnance was effectively a large paper bag full of small bits of aluminium foil, which when they landed on the electrical substation, caused the electrical substation to short out and blew all the fuses. And at the same time, we were launching the information operation so that when these people woke up in the morning and there was no power, we said to them, if you don't give up Milosevic, this is what's going to happen to you. Because we knew it wouldn't take them long to change the fuses, put new fuses back in and bring it back up again. Because we were then threatening to blow up the power stations. And what did the Western military command decide to do? It thought, well, that's a good idea. Let's go and blow up the power stations anyway. So we missed out the information phase, and they just dropped heavy ordnance. Now, that didn't give people a chance to change their mind. And it meant that the West then had to pay for all these power stations to be repaired very expensively so that the people of Serbia could at least exist after Milosevic had gone. And it's changing people's mindsets. Peter, you mentioned your military friends and, yes, of course, they're used to using tanks and guns and aircraft and bombs and all these sorts of things. But in the future, they've got to understand, that age-old thing that the Chinese understood is if you can defeat your enemy without fighting him, that's the way to do it. And if you can do it that way, people don't get killed, but you still get your strategic ends met. And it's changing the mindset of people.
So, Pat, on that note, are we actually in a state of war? Just not the kind of war that we're used to understanding. When you have the 20th century mindset, war means bombs, war means kinetics, war means airplanes and things that we can see, tangible things. But with all these things that are happening in the realm of cyber, it's covert, it's difficult to pin down. You've got plausible deniability working against you. I mean, to me, this kind of sounds like we are already taking this step toward war or some form of existing confrontation, which we haven't been able to call yet because we're in unfamiliar and, dare I say, uncharted waters.
Why would we call it if we're going to lose? We're currently in the losing position, so we're certainly not going to call it.
But
Sorry to
are
interrupt,
we there though? Are we already there? If we're not
Well, look,
calling
I think
it,
we're always in a state of conflict, if you
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
with the people who are, around us. So we're, if we go into work, we're trying to work better than Fred over here because, we want our boss to acknowledge that I'm the best and I should get promoted. There's always that tension that exists. And of course, here we are, I'm in the UK, you're in Australia, you've got intelligence organizations. What are they doing? They're trying to find out what are the threats that exist against Australia, against the United Kingdom, against America. They are probing things. Now, we tend to use a war, meaning bullets and whatever, except when we talk about shopping and we talk about a price war and the fact that the store down the road is selling some particular item of clothing at half price, so we're always in this tension situation. And what we've got to do is get a lot better, as I say, at managing these sorts of attacks on us. And it is very difficult, as Andy was saying. You can't just say, well, I'm going to respond against the Chinese government if the Chinese government can't be held. I mean, in international law, you cannot attack somebody unprovoked. And it's this issue of when do you move from cyber warfare to hard kinetic warfare? What is it that brings that about? Because whoever starts the kinetic bit first in international law is undoubtedly going to be the one that's most likely to be said to have started it.
Okay, Andy, you want to say something about this?
It's just following on from Pat there, and coming back to you, you use the term war. Difficult. I'm ex-military, so to me, war is kinetic. It's bombs and bullets.
Yeah.
The state we're in, yes, race tensions, conflict, but totally support what Pat said. Whoever throws the first bomb or bullet is going to be held accountable. Is that a realistic response? I don't think it is. But underpinning all this, we're talking about this as if we're surprised. If you look at the Chinese philosophy and strategy, they've been fairly, in Chinese terms, fairly open over 20 odd years about their aspirations and their view of technology and their use of it. And so they are, along with the Russians, who have described similar, different but similar, their view is that, what they're doing is normal relations. It is to them acceptable and a means to an end. And the means to the end is not warfare, it is gaining power. And by power, I mean knowledge and understanding. And they will use it pretty much any means that they can to get it. Certainly if it's not attributable.
Sure. Peter, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I think, again, what we're seeing is a development. I mean, both Pat and Andy have been talking about, it was ever thus, that conflict is ongoing, etc., etc. We've actually got to get over this because, in the 21st century, we are all becoming much, as this coronavirus has shown, just by the impact on the economy, we're all getting terribly, terribly interdependent. So this fact that nobody's been particularly grown up about this, that we're seeing this expression of, as Andy's just said, power and power projection. It's not really going to do anybody any good. I mean, you know, I'll take one of the points that Andy's made and say, you know, we are now actually, I wouldn't say cyber war, it's an information war that's going on. You know, there's this ability to exploit tensions. You know, you look at race at the moment, Black Lives Matter. If a nation wanted to be particularly unpleasant, it could start exploiting those tensions in various different states, because obviously the tension in America internally because of Black Lives Matter is very, very high at the moment. Then to actually take a point that Pat was making about, you know, economic aspirations, I don't know whether this is true or not, but the theatre director David Ayer used to say that the Americans had the stated interest, or the US State Department had the stated interest of owning more than 50% of the world's economy. So what you're seeing is, in cyberspace, in terms of the information war, you're seeing the tensions between, say, China and America being exemplified by this power projection. And yeah, there's another point I'd quite like to leave out there too, which is there are different ambitions in this. Russia is punching above its weight because it can use cyber to actually punch above its weight, because it's very good. And the Russians have always, if you look at the Second World War, they've always been very good at being able to dig in and to say, you know, yes, we can do this. Because you're actually with Russia, and Professor Mark Galeotti told me this, who's a big Russia expert. You know, the Russians have an economy the size of Spain's. So what you're doing is very, very successfly promoting yourself as being much, much more powerful than you are. And this, you know, I'm not being derogatory about the Spanish, but since the Armada, they've declined a little. The Chinese are, you know, their power objective seems to be different. It seems to be them saying, "Hey, we're big kids on the block now. We want you to take us seriously." Now, in that environment, that situation, we've now got AI coming. And this is one of the reasons why we all have to grow up about all of this, because, you know, you could, to take things that both Andy and Pat have been saying, be in a situation where your AI bots suddenly start launching a war just because they've escalated things. So we need to actually start getting above that world that Pat's been talking about, where you're trying to go into the office and compete for a position. We've actually got to mature, develop, and say, okay, this is a situation we're in. We need to put some deniability into the network. We also need to mandate that there are certain areas that do not get touched. There are certain bits of the infrastructure that, if they do get attacked, we will do something about that. NATO did actually say this a while ago, that in the event of a particular engagement, that they would see it as a precursor to kinetic warfare. My point is, and I hate to be boring about this, but you have to have deniability. So you have to have some means to know that you've been attacked right at base, and that you, given that, you've also got to start saying, actually, I'm going to, part of my participation in the 21st century is I'm going to get on board, and I'm actually going to be much more grown up about all of this.
Mm. Look, I have to say that it's been an interesting conversation so far. I need to just bring it back to Australia just for a moment, because I'd like to actually touch on what David had said earlier. Look, our systems down here have been routinely challenged by hostile cyber snooping for quite some time. We claim to be a high-tech advanced state. So why is it that lesser developed states, and I do rope in the People's Republic and Russia and North Korea and Iran in all of this, why are they so adept at this form of attack and high-tech states so vulnerable, apparently? I'll just go to David quickly, and then I'll go to you, Pat.
Just a couple of things there. To jump back to the point before this, we really need to change the language to what we're seeing as digital disruption and information advantage. And what we're watching is competition. If we don't take war off the table, then we're contributing to the continued problem of people who've been trained for kinetic war going, oh, I heard my keyword. If war is politics by other means, then let's redefine all of this. And it's pathetic we haven't. In terms of the responsibility of the Australian Prime Minister, the most logical thing he could do is do something about digital hygiene. If the Estonians can go from a total hack to digital hygiene begins at age 4, so their society understands what's going on, understands what it means, understands what a vulnerability is, and doesn't see this as war or as a basis for racism, we've had 10 years to learn these lessons and we haven't done a damn thing. So it comes back to two classic things to link back into what you just said, John. First of all, we always hide behind someone's skirt and take no responsibility for the broad strategic position. And secondly, it's the Sean McFate argument that we still think we can win conventional wars because we haven't changed the language and understood no one since Gulf War I wants to fight one of them.
Yeah, true. Pat?
Yes, I mean, to build on what David said, I mean, I think that you posed the question, why is it that in a high-tech society we don't have the advantage? Well, because the whole nature of the thing is very asymmetric. It is a small, it doesn't cost very much. It requires geekery. Well, that's not restricted to high-tech organizations. As Peter was saying, young children in Delhi managed to teach themselves how to use a computer without really having much input from outside. And so you can get a small group of people together who will find challenge and reward in trying to overcome firewalls and other defenses that the high-tech world has put in to them, and will respond accordingly. After all, I mean, in the late 1990s, the place where most of these things began was Bulgaria, which is not renowned as being a high-tech country, but it had some of the very best computer hackers that you could come across. It's a form of guerrilla warfare. And as the big military nations know to their cost, guerrilla warfare is expensive. It's a large amount of attrition. You can't go out and hold a tank battle or just bomb them out of existence because they're not there. They're moving around. They're much more flexible. And we do have to change our mindset. We do have to make sure that there are people who are running our countries and our military who recognize that the answer to everything is not drop a bomb on
it. Andy?
Yeah. Following on from David and Pat, totally agree with David. Estonia probably not the best example because the amount that was invested by NATO in helping them get past the attack was massive and carries on. But developing the education from early days, the reality is that high-tech nations, by definition, are the most vulnerable. We have the biggest field of targets of anybody, just by the very definition. And unless we educate and get people, Joe Public, educated, it's always going to be so. We've got to get kids to understand hygiene, electronic hygiene, whether it's from 4 or 5 or whatever, but from a very early age, when they start to use the technology. The big problem at the moment we have is the technology is ubiquitous. Everybody's got it, everybody uses it, and we take all of our bad habits from our home, where we, in reality, for the majority, don't care about security. We want ease of access, we want ease of use. And we take all of these bad habits into the workplace. Yeah. Because it's the same technology. So we've got to get ourselves over that and become better. And that's not a short-term thing. That's got to be, you know, a long-term aspiration. And we're 20 years too late starting.
Pete?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm following on from what everybody says. I mean, there's sort of a broad agreement. I'm writing a book about regulating AI at the moment for Bloomsbury. There's a good pump for myself. The one thing that's come out of interviewing some of the top people in the world, AI experts, and oddly philosophers, because philosophers are now heavily involved in the ethics of AI, it's just that basically the big problem that we have with AI is that it learns from us. It learns all of our bad habits. It learns, Microsoft can put a bot out there, it becomes racist in 24 hours. Surprise, surprise. The issue is the internet is a mirror to ourselves. And in a sense, to go to Andy's point, yeah, it's not just teaching hygiene at that very early age. It's not picking up, the kids at 4. You're also having to teach people what is right and wrong. So we need to start doing all of those things to actually try to correct the problems that we're generating for ourselves. In terms of why is Australia vulnerable? Well, again, to pick up on what Andy and Pat have been saying, you've got the infrastructure, therefore there's more to hit. The more dependent you become on technology, then the clue is in the word dependent, because someone will hit what you're dependent on, and then that will have an impact. In terms of what this can actually mean, I went on Sky TV, and this was a few years back, and I was pointing out that Nortel was a huge, huge player in telecommunications. Then suddenly it wasn't. And there's this company called China, which was enormously successful in developing the telecommunications industry. And the company that came out of that was Huawei. I spoke to the guy who was one of the people who was in charge of security at Nortel. He said that they found that all of the top 120 executives at Nortel had their computers hacked. The company was lost. He said the thing that really damaged them most wasn't the IPR they lost. It was the fact that the Chinese were, or if it were Huawei, I'm not suggesting for the moment it were, but they did seem to do quite well out of it, that they were going into meetings where they were actually able to undercut anything that Nortel was doing, because they knew what Nortel's strategy was going to be. That was the most damaging thing as far as they were concerned. The point I was making on Sky TV was that if somebody had bombed Nortel, the Canadians would have responded, instead of which, this industry that was responsible for employing a huge amount of people in that particular area suddenly didn't exist any longer. And we had exactly the same thing with Marconi too. But anyway, I think somebody else wants to say something.
Tim, and then we'll move to Andy.
Apologies, Andy. I stepped in line there. I want to just briefly go back to the previous point. We mentioned earlier that cyber terrorism is a theory. It seems logical to me that then cyber war should also be kind of in that theoretical category, that we shouldn't necessarily label it war if it's, let's say, not been kind of proven to be that. And obviously you guys are obviously in favor of kind of changing that language a bit anyway. But the word that I wanted to focus on, which I think Pat brought up, was attrition, which seems to be the Chinese kind of status quo, right? It's especially in our case in Australia, seems to be the continual pressuring and pushing the boundaries, and just pushing on those pressure points with Australia to kind of establish themselves as that kind of big kid, as the bigger player, as the dominant force in that relationship. And that's going to happen, you would imagine, in every kind of possible way. So, you know, as advanced as we are, we're still kind of we've mentioned this before, we're still educating Chinese students, and then they will head back to their homeland and basically take all of that with them. So we've not been particularly protective of our kind of cyber assets, let's say, in the sense that, you know, we haven't been putting up, you know, firewalls, and you guys have kind of been talking about like the borders, let's say, you guys have been talking about as well, but we've also not been protective of our training in that area as well. And so even if we were the more advanced, if that's what you would like to call it, even if we were that force, when we're not doing anything to, let's say, stop our enemies or people we're in conflict with from kind of sapping that information. So it doesn't really seem like there's much point in kind of asserting whether we're more, you know, advanced or less advanced, if realistically they have access to all of our advancements anyway. That's, I don't know, it's just what I think.
Just before we get to Andy, I just need to say something here. And that is that I think that really comes down to the fact that there are states in the world that are highly motivated. And yes, they have capacities, like China has capacities because of their, you know, educational exchange programs, but they have a will and they have a plan, and they're not shy of actually implementing it. But they also know something else about us. They know that we're vulnerable, not just from a technological standpoint, but from a political standpoint. Because, you know, when confronted with, like, you know, Australia's been recently confronted by this, you know, Chinese attack, reputedly, we're not going to do too much. We can't really do too much. And I think that knowledge is as much part of the whole information war thing, but also a psychological operation at the same time, because they kind of almost expect that we're not going to say anything that's going to necessarily be too offensive to the Chinese, because then that'll give the Chinese a free kick, and so on and so forth.
But is that because we think that, or the common thought is that we can't do anything about it, or is it actually because we can't do anything about it? I guess that's
well, actually, that leads to that's a segue into something that we can actually pursue after we've had Andy. Andy, please.
Picking up on a couple of points, one from Peter and one from Tim. Tim, you know, I think you're absolutely right about the language and so forth. But the reality is Australia is a very big trading partner with China. Certainly when you move to Western Australia and you look at Rio Tinto and the like. But also your education system and the income in that sector. So, you know, it's a partnership where they buy from you, an imbalanced partnership, I would suggest. So in reality, something you have to deal with. But going back to Peter's point, he raised a very good point about what people's understanding of right and wrong is and how we educate them. And the reality is, you know, we have a very Western mentality and way of looking at things. So our view of what's right and what's wrong is very different from the Chinese view of what's right and what's wrong, what's acceptable. And we have to understand their perspective if we're going to deal with them.
Actually, our resident existentialist philosopher is just sitting there, and he needs to chime in here because, come on, David, you've got to, you're going to have an opinion on this one.
Oh, look, it's just a case of a question of commitment. Most of the last 5 or 6 issues we've been talking about all come down to the same thing. People who want something and can become committed can maintain the pressure to achieve attrition on us because we're not committed enough to apply attrition back on them. We will sell the Chinese any education they're willing to pay for without thinking about the consequences, because thinking about the consequences would hurt. That would be a form of attrition in itself. We would have to surrender making money by throwing shit away and giving it away freely. And that's just, commitment has been the most consistent thing in human history in all forms of conflict and competition. The most committed person may fail early, but they tend to learn, and as long as they can stay committed. And with the patriotic education policy, China pours out millions of 20-year-olds every year with 15 to 16 years of patriotic education policy, giving them a level of competition and commitment that makes them, truly dangerous to the rest of the world.
I'm wondering, there is something called quantum computing, which apparently is now something that the Chinese have taken a huge lead on. But, the US and Japan, they also have their own quantum computing capacities. And I understand the nature of commerce in the world. All roads lead to China at the moment. In spite of COVID, I know that we're going to be repatriating plant at some point, and making China a little bit more manageable and smaller as an entity. But that's going to take some time to actually achieve. In the meantime, we are caught up in this info war. We do have technical capabilities. But is it because of the interlinkages in commerce and the fact that our political classes tend to pay homage to the business class, and the business class wants to make money out of China, that the political class feels constrained that they cannot act with a free hand? Just putting it out there.
Well, that seems very clear. In Australia, for example, the business elite lean on the political elite.
Yeah.
In China and Russia, the political elite lean on the business elite. And if the business elite want to continue to be the business elite, they find a way to make money and to fit the long-term view.
And therein lies our vulnerability.
And our vulnerability until their own people recognize they suffer the consequences of that. So you're at the whim of the system breaking rather than us competing with it.
If I can turn to Pat for his view on this.
I mean, you are describing, of course, the fundamental fissure that exists between authoritarian states and democracies. And I think it was Winston Churchill who said, a democracy is a pretty poor way of running a government, but it's the least worst. And of course, we in the West champion individualism within a democratic framework. Authoritarian regimes champion the regime, and there is no such thing as individuality. People have to be supporting the regime. So, I mean, in China, that, of course, is expressed in Confucianism, that the individual is subordinate to the whole. And as long as you have these fundamental differences, we will have the fractures that we see in the world at the moment. And, there was a rather naive view that said we need to have more Chinese students coming over because they'll be exposed to democracy. They'll begin to understand the great advantage that democracy can give them. They can play a role as individuals. And China, of course, we tried this with Russia, of course, in the 1990s, and it certainly hasn't worked over the last 20 years. And, we can only now wait and hope that it will be the Chinese middle classes who, as they go in their increasing numbers to visit overseas and everything else, I mean, if you look at the change in meat consumption in China. It is growing at a huge rate because the middle classes say, I want to eat meat not once a day, not once a week. I want to eat it every day of the week. And I want choice cuts of meat. And I want to be able to buy the things I want to buy. And of course, as that middle class grows, hopefully so will, what was it that Maslow called it? The self-actualization, you know, the view of I as an individual want to have more control of my life, because when that happens, their future horizons will become more Western and will be looking on a year-to-year basis ahead. How can I improve my life and my children's life, rather than following a traditional Confucian view that says, how can I make sure that my descendants in 100 or 200 years' time can have a better society in which to live?
Can I rain on your parade for a sec?
Of course you can, David.
I think one of the problems we have now is that historically middle classes had power in transforming countries because they couldn't leave. Whereas what we see now with China, and it's data they're very careful about protecting, is the rate at which millionaires leave. They don't stay there and try and change the system. They take the money they can make within a corrupt authoritarian state and disappear as rapidly as possible by situating their kids in the West and then following if they possibly can. So unfortunately, what we're seeing here with a massive population is they can bear the brain drain in a way that historically wouldn't have been possible.
And the Russians are doing the same.
Yes.
Well, doesn't the UK have the largest expat Russian population in Europe?
Duh.
Yes, duh. You might get to see Olga sometime, Pat.
Or Svetlana.
That's you. Well, look, it's interesting. I'm just curious what Pete has to say with regard to vulnerabilities, because, you know, when we talk about vulnerabilities, it's easy to get caught up in the technology because, of course, that's the front end of things. That's the things that we can see. It's the things that we can get our heads around. But really, the incomprehensibility of our political processes, and you deal with politicians a lot, Pete, you know, over the years. I mean, you would have seen how commercial interests in London may very well have trumped political interests. And the idea that we were talking about earlier of having some sort of mandated policies whereby government can do something in terms of, you know, protecting various companies that are critical to the running of, say, the UK or Australia for that matter. I mean, these kind of things you'd have to bring the business elites on board. They'd all have to be singing off the same song sheet as the government. Otherwise, they'll put up so much resistance that anything that you try would be pointless, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I had, and indeed, a message has just flashed across my screen from a politician while we've been talking, who I'm talking to.
Great minds.
And that politician was an enormously powerful politician in terms of technology. So I'm going to be quite careful what I'm going to say. My experience of working with politicians, and this is going to be a terrible thing to say, is that most of them know nothing about technology. They really do not know anything about technology. I had a meeting in the House of Commons, or the Houses of Parliament, in fact, with a former Home Secretary who started telling me about this terrible thing called information war and how he was going to sort of put together a think tank to do with it. And let's call him John. I said, John, people have been doing this for years, mate. You know, what you're talking about at the moment, you're 7 years behind the curve. And he looked at me in quite a shocked way. And I was thinking, let's call him Harry. Yeah,
Better.
You're a former Home Secretary. You know?
But he was too busy
Why
with
didn't
Svetlana for
somebody-
7 years.
Somebody was evidently not telling you much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's an issue, and a massive issue, because if you want to get something changed, then the politicians have to understand. You know, currently I'm trying to get in contact with Lord Maud, who's Francis Maud, who was I think his last role was as a Cabinet Office Secretary. So, Francis, if you can hear, can you please pick up the phone? The reason I wanted to get a hold of him was because he was seen as by the civil servants as being very effective because he got technology. He was the person who actually pushed through the cyber insurance that was necessary to underpin the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, because, surprise, surprise, you need deniability. You need to actually have somebody to say, yes, I have had a breach. You have to put that infrastructure up. I was actually in meetings with Francis Maud and the insurance industry, and I made the point on their behalf saying, you're trying to get the insurance industry to underwrite the costs of cyber breaches without giving them the information on which to base their risk. And why on earth should they do that? You know, you've got to get people to put their hands up and say, yes, I've been breached, so you can get some actual handle on what's going on. So I'm going to be really boring and bang on about the thing that I have been saying about you have to have some means of knowing what's going on built into the network, and we signally failed to do that. And I know I've said that over and over and over again. I think that to go to something that David said, when David was saying about, you know, they've got more commitment and we need more commitment, that reminded me of General Buck Turgidson in Dr. Strangelove when he was saying, okay, we're going to bomb the hell out of each other and let's get into the coal mines, but let's make sure that we've got more Svetlanas and Olgas in our coal mines so that we can breed better than they can. You know, unless you get out of that mindset of we're always going to be in this permanent competition, well, you will be in permanent competition because you won't have grown up. In terms of what Pat was saying about trying to educate middle classes, well, sure, fine. And everybody eating more meat and hoping that's going to change. Well, unfortunately, what's going to happen there is we're going to advance rapidly towards more climate change, which was somewhere where we were before all of this. That's not good. I think, yeah, obviously we have, as you say, David here as our existential philosopher. That's what we need. Bizarrely, I interviewed Professor well, it wasn't bizarre that I interviewed him, Professor Luciano Floridi, who is a professor of philosophy and ethics at Oxford, who has now become the advisor to the Turing Institute, and is now advising the government, or is one of the increasing amount of advisors that the government has from ethics to do with technological development. And Floridi was making a joke that it was very amusing for him that philosophers were now being brought in to make pragmatic decisions. It's probably not behind times. It is, and to go to a point, another point that was made, I think by Tim, I think that we keep on talking in an outdated language and in an outdated mindset about what's going on. We've got something called social media, which is a sort of expression of certain elements in our national consciousness of certain motivations. I think that what we're seeing in cyber warfare is almost like nation-state social media. And we haven't quite got to grips with the fact that, people are slagging each other off and finding this new mechanism as a means of political coercion. Then there's a final couple of points I want to make, which is, again, Andy mentioned Rio Tinto. Well, way back, there were a lot of examples of theft of information from Rio Tinto, which goes back to the Nortel thing, and what the Chinese were doing was stealing information from Australian mining companies because it wanted to affect the futures market in its own interests. And we've got to realise that those things are, as important as this alleged the theft of intellectual property. And finally, in my high-speed rant, I do go back to this thing about mandating. If you want to have the cybersecurity that protects Australia, protects the UK, protects others, New Zealand, then what you've got to do is the government has to actually step in, and this goes back to Pat's report, and it has to say, okay, we know that cybersecurity is difficult for you. We also know that Olga and Svetlana keep knocking on your door. So what we're going to do is say, in the same way that the government has said that there are 4 companies that major corporates should go to in the event of them thinking that they've been hacked, they should also say there are these other companies that you can go to. They can take this whole nightmare of cyber off your heads, use those companies and they'll protect you. And that's where your comeback is. Again, it's growing into the 21st century. It's understanding the way the 21st century works. And I'm sorry for ranting on so many different levels. That's all right. No problems. We're going to move on to Andy. You have anything that you'd like to add to what Peter said?
No, difficult to follow Pete after a rant. I do think he makes some good points there, though. We have to change the mindset. We have to change the way we're thinking about the problem. And yeah, one of the issues in UK, of course, is that a lot of the CNI isn't owned by UK companies. It's owned by overseas companies and corporations, which makes life more difficult if you're going to levy them to put funds in to provide security, because they're saying, business risk, we're prepared to tolerate a level of disruption because the cost of not is too high. Pat will remember, we were both in the military when we went from risk avoidance to risk management. And at that time, I was responsible for the security of military networks around the world. And the way it was approached was, we're not going to avoid risk anymore. We're going to realize that we can't afford it. So we're going to manage it. And who are we going to get to manage it? We're going to get all those people that used to avoid it to manage the new environment. And of course, the whole mindset was wrong, because they managed to manage risk by avoiding it. So we haven't moved on. And it took a few years to sort of migrate into the new mentality. And I think we're in a similar situation now on a broader scale.
Well, I have a question that I hope someone would be able to answer, because it's becoming increasingly obvious that I don't think there are any easy answers to anything that we're talking about right now. But just to add to the complication, how do we manage public expectations about information warfare? So from an Australian perspective, David and I do a lot of commentary in the local media, and it's... The media is an interesting beast, as of course Pete will know, and that is that they try to reduce everything to a kind of simplified message, and I'm being very generous here. But there, when the Prime Minister of a country comes out and says, "Look, guys, we've been hacked," and then the media is going, "Oh wow, who was it?" And then, of course, other people come in from left field, usually from the Beltway or our version of the Beltway in Canberra, and all they do is stoke fire. What do we do, or what should the media do in terms of managing public expectations at a time of non-kinetic hostilities, strategic competition, information warfare, call it what you want? Because, of course, the public does have an expectation that Australia, in our case now, we're going to be striking back, right? The
No,
Chinese
they
have done
don't
it,
have that expectation.
don't they?
No, I think that's one thing the Australian population is very sure of, is that we won't do anything.
Well, no, they know that we're not going to do anything, but I think that there's still that sort of subconscious expectation that, hey, listen, the government, they've got everything under control. They're going to be doing something. They're going to be doing something. What is that something?
No, it's the
Quiet
desperate
Australia
belief in
wants them to do
conservatism.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was that? Oh, hang on a sec.
Sorry.
David first and then Tim.
So I was just saying, it's the desperate belief that somehow conservatives in Australia know what they're doing.
Well,
there's a desire to do something, but precisely the people that have that desire are precisely the audience that the media has to dumb the message down for. Sorry, but that's just true. So it depends on when you say what the media should do. Are you talking about in the interests of the people or in the interests of the media? Because
Well,
no,
national
in the interest of the
security.
people. I mean, I would like to say that there is such a thing as the interest of the public, but of course, in terms of how the public interact with the media, things usually go pear-shaped. But I'm curious as to, there will be some people out there in the community who will think, well, okay, look, we've been hacked. Odds are that it was China. It was a state actor. The Prime Minister said so. What will our response be? I mean, it's kind of like the whole standoff between China and India over the Himalayas there. It's just one of those things where Modi gets thrown the ball and then he's kind of dropped it and he doesn't know how to respond. So he's sending out mixed messages all over the place. The Indian public obviously want to know where they're going with this whole brouhaha over China, as the Australian public, at least a percentage of, will want to know where the government is going with this cyber attack on Australia. How does that all work?
Well, it won't work. We'll get racism on the streets because there won't be a government response that means anything or makes any sense to a genuine populace who haven't been educated in anything related to the topic. Like, to say it's the media's responsibility when the Prime Minister has a communications team who appear to once again be incompetent.
Can I just follow up on David's point and follow up from some themes earlier on? I mean, I think, in the old-fashioned sense, we've got to mobilise the troops. This is very much a pan Australian population, pan community problem in whichever country you're in. You can do some short-term things, which are, you've got to make sure that people understand the nature of the threat. And you may have to do this in really simplistic terms, in just the same way we've been tackling the COVID-19 pandemic. You need some snappy lines. You need to make sure that people don't expose their own personal computer systems. They don't do, they can understand the damage that can be done. And then we need to pick up on the Estonian thing. We need to make sure that the young people, who, thank heavens, are probably going to understand this problem a lot better than we do, we need to make sure that they are exposed to the issues around this from a very young age. So they understand that there are people, entities, individuals, groups, countries, whoever they may be, who will wish to damage our infrastructure. And if you go and look what happens in the Baltic nations now, even at the youngest of ages, they understand an awful lot more about cyber security. Now, we can do that by putting it fundamentally into the education of young people.
There's one thing that sorry, go on. Sorry.
I've actually got written down here education, which is not a Blairite statement. To go to your point about the media, The problem that you have with the media is the media have been pretty irresponsible about all of this. I spoke to a leading journalist last week who said that the only stories that she'd been tasked to do with technology were internet child abuse, the normal sort of and nastiness on the internet, the normal sort of shock horror thing. The media does need to be more responsible. However, I personally have been saying to news desks for about 30 years that they need to take technology more seriously. I can remember 30 years ago having a conversation with the deputy editor of the Sunday Mirror, trying to get him to do some stories about cybersecurity. And he turned around to me and said, Pete, mate, there's only two things the public are interested in: sex and money, mate, sex and money, in that order. And it hasn't really changed. That I had a conversation with the deputy editor of one of the most famous, the deputy news editor of one of the most famous broadsheets about a month ago. And I said, you've got to start doing more stuff about technology, more stuff about mainstream technology, because this is running our world. And he said, yeah, the problem is the readers. You know, we were having this discussion, and we were saying, you've got to repeat a story at least 10 times for people to get an understanding. This is one of the most intellectual publications we have in the UK in terms of, you know, newspapers and the media. So there is a responsibility on newspaper editors to start to take it seriously, but then they'll just come back and say, very much like Tony Frost, the former deputy editor of the Sunday Mirror, who I think is the editor, or was the editor, of the National Enquirer in America until just recently, is sex and money line, because they're only doing that because they're in the business of selling newspapers. So you give the public what they want. So in a sense, we're in this horrible, it's not a virtuous circle, it's a very immoral circle. And that needs to be corrected, where everybody needs to start, you know, taking more responsibility, being a bit more intellectual about this, not clicking on the terms and conditions, as Andy was saying. And you know, I mean, I just want to. Pat says that the children are going to be better. No, they're better at understanding how apps work rather than actually understanding how computer systems work, or sort of the morality of things. I despair when I look out of my window and see all of these children walking along with this thing in front of their faces, because I'm sitting there thinking how readily they can actually be programmed and be diverted by an information war working on social media to whip them up or whatever. The fact that they are so wedded to these devices seems to me to be a bit of a worry, because that strikes me as digital dependency that you really need to sort of start dealing with. So yeah, education. Though there is another factor in everything that we've been saying, because some of the commentators, and this is nothing to do with what I've just been talking about, some of the commentators have been saying that the attack on Australia by China is because there is a perception among the Chinese that the Australians are the weak end of the Five Eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, I'm glad that you raised that. What of the Five Eyes? I've heard now that, you know, Australia and the United States are starting to, you know, get a little bit more, well, I suppose, dare I say, closer in terms of trying to get on top of cyber. You know, we want to now extend Five Eyes into the commercial domain. I mean, we want to actually recreate the Five Eyes to be the block against the Sino-Russian aggressors out there and all their various trolls. Is this a good thing, or are we flogging a dead horse? I mean, Five Eyes was created for a set group of issues. I mean, can we redevelop it? Can we turn it into the thing that will keep us all safe at night? Maybe Pat will have a go, and then Andy.
I think that the Five Eyes in itself has an issue. which is, it was very clearly when it was started, it was a way of linking 5 nations that had a very firmly white Anglo-Saxon background together in sharing things together because we didn't trust Johnny Foreigner to be able to share them. So I think, you know, we have a perception problem from the outset. And of course, at the same time, we want to have a group of us that have similar sorts of backgrounds, ambitions, visions for the future, etc. And we're in a very difficult position at the moment in that we have one Donald Trump as President of the United States, who is seemingly quite happy to dump friends and allies at the drop of a hat when he doesn't feel that it fits into whatever, dare I say it, is his deranged image of the world at that moment in time. So, you know, there are some issues that need to be overcome in this. I think is, you know, cyber warfare an issue that affects all democracies? Yes, it is. How can we get a better understanding of that in a broader context? You know, India is one of the world's largest democracies. And yes, it has its problems, but tell me any democracy that doesn't. And, you know, we should be involving them in some of these things. And I have to say, making use of their software skills that they have in abundance in India. So, you know, that's my 2 pennyworth, but we do have to be careful of not talking up Five Eyes as being the greatest thing since sliced bread was invented.
You mean sliced white bread?
Oh,
Yeah.
that was droll.
Oh, boom, boom. Okay, I know. Okay, Andy, what's your view on the Five Eyes?
I agree with Pat. I don't think probably it's the right platform. You know, when it came into being, it had a function. I think we've moved beyond that. You can't ignore, first of all, you know, the rest of Europe. You can't ignore countries like India. They need to be part of it, whatever it is. It does need to be multinational and international. And it goes against the tenets of everything Five Eyes because it needs to be about sharing information broadly, which Five Eyes was never intended for. You know, in fact, it was quite the opposite. It was intended that it wasn't shared beyond the boundaries. So, no, it's not the right platform. And when you talk about taking it from government and extending it into commercial, you've got to start on a national level to do that. You've got to have a national level infrastructure that's capable of sharing that sort of information. And, you know, to some degree, you have the core, as do most of the developed nations. So that's my 2 pennyworth, you know, and yeah, you know, thanks for Pat for holding back on his thoughts on Donald Trump.
Yes. Okay. Well, anyway, look, gentlemen, I just want one final question. I'll do the rounds and then we'll wrap things up. Now, one of the things that we haven't spoken about, I mean, we spoke about the state actors' role in information war, but we haven't talked about the black hat versus white hat. You know, we haven't talked about the creepy guy in the cellar hunched over his computer doing whatever, and he's not necessarily in the pay of a state. He's probably just that, I think it was mentioned earlier in the piece, that malicious dude, that nerd that just gets off on his little patch of power in that whole global infrastructure of the internet, you know, that he can do something or she can do something damaging and just enjoys that. What do we do in terms of protecting state assets, cyber assets, against the continuing pilfering of our systems and probing from these non-state actors who don't necessarily have state affiliations? I'll start with you, Andy.
It's, you know, we've missed out. We've talked about nation state actors, but, you know, organized crime, let's not ignore it. It's responsible for probably far more of the activity than any of the APTs that we've alluded to. There has always been a malicious actor individual. And as Peter, I think, earlier said, you know, the problem is asymmetry. No, it's the low cost of entry to have a disproportionate effect. And how do you stop it affecting state assets? The same way you do for every other threat. You know, they are no different. They're just as difficult to attribute. And, you know, in reality, the current activity in Australia may well be non-state. The suspicion is strongly that it's not, to grant you. But, you know, we can't attribute it. The problem is, you know, with nation state, you've got persistence. They will keep coming back. They will keep doing it. Whereas an individual is less likely to. Organized crime wants money. It wants profit. So that's the sort of ransomware DDoS type attacks that we're seeing against some organizations. But, you know, the better protection, better defenses is the answer.
Pat?
I entirely agree with Andy. I think that there are occasions when these small groups of, be it organised crime or be it small groups of activists as they're often called, get suborned by states to do their dirty work for them. That's nothing new. That's been going on since time immemorial. And it comes down to that thing of making sure the population are educated on these sorts of things. You know, the fact that now the banks are coming out and saying, well, we're going to make it a bit more difficult. You know, there are going to be some procedures you need to go through when you want to do something, is really good. It's about time the banks took the initiative on this, so that if I now want to charge something to my bank account, I can pick up my smartphone and do it. And then at some point, they'll say, well, wait on a minute, you need to fill in bits of your password, or you need to, you know, go and answer this email or whatever. That's the way to do it. It is to make sure that people are cautious, because if individuals in a company don't click on a link, are assiduous and not putting any connection to the outside, you will secure them. You will secure those secrets and keep them where they're supposed to be. But it requires people to be educated and people to practice time and time again using good husbandry.
Pete?
I actually think it's sort of, it's more complicated and less complicated than that. If I'm walking along the street and I hear somebody going, psst, psst, wait, over here, and I see some dodgy bloke, I don't, you know, go over to him. I think you're a dodgy bloke, and you know, here you go. I want you to sign this because I've got £1 million for you. I'm sitting there thinking, no, you're a nutter. So it's that attitude that we have in normal life, that you just have to go onto the internet. Why this credulity gap that suddenly appears because we're looking at a computer screen has always puzzled me. Now, so to go to Pat's thing, yeah, people need to be responsible. They need to grow up. I think that they should have been made responsible for looking after their computer systems ages ago. I can remember when I got a hard drive that Andy and I, we were doing an experiment, and this guy in, I think he was in South Wales, wasn't he, Andy? The bloke, and we had all of these details of his family, and I said, oh, I know all of these things about your daughter, and I've got all of these pictures. And he went completely bonkers. And he said, the government should be doing something about that. No, mate, it was your computer. You should have been doing something about it. You shouldn't have let us get hold of your hard drive. In terms of the hackers, those hackers are actually a little bit easier to deal with, as Andy has made the point. They're after money. Organised criminals want money. And so you know where they're coming from. 1/6 of all ransomware attacks, people pay the money out for ransomware. So that, you know, is the proof. They're doing that because they're making money. So people need to wake up again to the information age. And another reason for dealing, though, with those hackers who are allegedly just sitting there doing stuff for organized crime is there is a crossover, particularly in Russia, between organized crime and the state, because the Russian organized criminals are used as extraterritorials by the Russian state. I was in the office of Len Hines when he was the head of the National High-Tech Crime Unit, and they were saying that there was a particular individual that they had wanted to extradite, and the Russian state had turned around and said, no, you can't have him, he's one of ours. So those links have to be broken. But again, all of this goes to this issue that we have about people, competition, and being in the 21st century. All of these problems will continue unless we actually start to be much more ethical, much better as human beings. And this affects our long-term development in terms of things like artificial intelligence, etc., etc. Because an artificial intelligence program, in fact, Professor Neil Lawrence made this point to me, there's a piece of technology which is fascinating. It's called What's Governor, and it is a centrifuge that governs how much steam goes into an engine. It's an intelligent device. It is not intelligent. It doesn't have consciousness. It's a piece of metal that spins as a law of physics. Computer programs do what you tell them to.
Tim, and then David.
I'm a little bit more cynical about the education part of this. How you would implement it is kind of, it is obviously up to policymakers, and we're just kind of making the point that it needs to happen. But you know, if we've said earlier in this discussion that the internet is a reflection of us, and that the worst of it is also a reflection of us, and we've also talked about how the media is not necessarily following up on their responsibilities and reporting it, and perhaps that's down to the lowest denominator in terms of their audience. I'm cynical about the education of that as well, and that education of information technology education as well, and perhaps we need to accommodate the lowest denominator by introducing something like a license. If you have the right to technology, phones, internet, all the access, those kinds of things, and that the government wants to be on top of our security as a nation and on an individual basis, then like cars, which have the capacity to be dangerous within a society, our citizens probably need some kind of license and registration, and part of that registration might even be that you need to meet the basic needs of having antiviral software, having possibly even having a VPN or something like that. So I would think that you would need to implement it in a way that it's not necessary. You need to the responsibilities on individuals, but you also need to put fail safes in there for the people who aren't going to take up the responsibility, because I'm just a little bit cynical about that.
Final thoughts, David?
Yeah, I can't help but sit here thinking about Foucault and the panopticon, that the best way to make humans behave is surveillance. The internet historically allows people who are motivated to avoid surveillance, and other people think they're anonymous and behave poorly. So Pete's point from early on in this, that the biggest thing we need is to shine a light on networks that said this person did this, and to remove as much anonymity as possible. And accept this saves you having to drive 3 hours. Instead, you can do it as a transaction, but it's visible. And I think the only way to get better behavior is actually going to be to increase visibility. And for those people who don't like it, they'll go to the dark web, and good luck to them. They'll find all the other weirdos just like them, and they'll rip each other off. But maybe if a proportion of us are willing to be in a more visible space where what we do can be seen, and there is a clear pattern and path to behavior, we could at least get a moderately safer space that can then be extended to other people in other countries. So instead of having the Five Eyes that wants to hide everything, we could have the 30 Ds, the 30 democracies that want to secure a relatively transparent environment. And I'm not going to assume, like Pete, that maybe we can improve our behavior, that we can evolve into being nicer critters. I'm going to say that with surveillance, we want to be nicer critters because we don't want to get the searchlight on us.
That's interesting that you say that you want to sacrifice privacy for safety, David.
Yeah, but again, you and I have had this chat before, and we both don't have a massive problem with that.
No, not at all.
Okay, well, anyway, gentlemen, that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us today and for sharing your insights on STRATEGIKON. And to our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of STRATEGIKON through the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can now also watch our podcasts on video on the STRATEGIKON Raw YouTube channel, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. If you would like to support STRATEGIKON, remember to check out our merch page. We have a wide variety of items to keep the STRATEGIKON listeners satisfied. Until next time, goodbye.